The first thing Stephen Archer heard was not a gunshot but a groan, low and broken, carried on the dry wind that swept down from the Black Range in the autumn of 1878. And it was that sound alone that turned his horse off the trail toward a shape crumpled in the rocks that he would otherwise have ridden straight past. He had been 3 days out of Socorro, driving a string of 6 horses south toward Silver City for a rancher who paid fair wages and asked no questions. And he had learned long ago in his 28 years to mind his own business on the trails of the New Mexico Territory, where a man's curiosity could get him killed faster than his enemies could. But there was something in that groan, something so raw and human, that he could not ride past it, and so he swung down from his saddle with his rifle in hand and found a man lying in a wash of his own blood beneath a juniper tree, his shirt dark and stiff, his face the color of ash. "Mister," Stephen said, kneeling beside him, "who did this to you?" The man's eyes opened, pale blue and glassy with pain, and it took him a long moment to focus on Stephen's face. When he spoke, his voice was a dry rasp like paper tearing. "Rourke's men took my gold, left me for the buzzards." He coughed and blood flecked his lips. "How far to water?" "There's a spring not a quarter-mile back," Stephen said, already reaching for his canteen. "I will bring you some." "No time for that," the man said, and his hand, thin and trembling, closed around Stephen's wrist with a strength that startled him. "Listen to me. I am dying and I know it, so do not waste your kindness pretending otherwise. My name is Thomas Hale. I have been 2 years in the Pinos Altos diggings, and I found silver enough to buy a farm and a future, and I was riding home to marry the woman I love when those men found me on the road." Stephen looked at the wound in the man's side, dark and wide, and knew Thomas Hale spoke true. There would be no doctor close enough, no way to stop the bleeding that had already soaked through 2 layers of cloth. He had seen men die from lesser wounds on cattle drives, men who might have lived if help had come an hour sooner, and he understood that for Thomas Hale, that hour had already passed somewhere back along the trail. "Tell me her name," Stephen said quietly, because he did not know what else to offer a dying man except the promise of being heard. "Louisa," Thomas whispered, and something in his ruined face softened, as if the name itself were a balm. "Louisa Crawford. She lives in Mesilla, above her father's old store, though her father is dead now, and her mother too, gone 3 years to the cholera. She has been raising her brother and sister alone, waiting for me to send word, waiting for me to come home." His breath rattled. "I wrote to her every month for the first year. Then the letters stopped reaching her, I think, because outlaws have been raiding the mail riders on the Silver City Road, and I have had no word back in almost a year. She must think I abandoned her." "Mr. What did you say your name was?" "Stephen Archer." "Mr. Archer." Thomas's grip tightened. "I need you to do something for me, and I have no right to ask it of a stranger, but there is no one else. Reach into my coat, the inside pocket there." Stephen did as he was told and drew out a small leather pouch, worn soft with handling, and inside it a woman's ring, a thin gold band with a small clear stone, and a letter folded many times over, the paper gone soft at the creases, addressed in careful handwriting to Miss Louisa Crawford, Mesilla, New Mexico Territory. "That letter has been in my pocket since the spring," Thomas said. "I wrote it the night I struck the vein that made my fortune, and I meant to give it to her myself when I arrived, but now I think you must carry it instead. Tell her I loved her every day I was gone. Tell her I never stopped meaning to come home, and that if she has waited this long already, she should know it was not in vain, that I thought of her with every shovel of earth I turned. Tell her," he stopped, his eyes filling with a grief that had nothing to do with his own dying. "Tell her she must not go on grieving a man who is not worth her tears. Tell her to live, Mr. Archer. Tell her to find happiness, whatever shape it takes, because I would rather she laughed again in this world than wept for me in it." Stephen felt his throat tighten in a way it had not since his own mother's burial. "I will find her," he said. "I swear it before God I will find her, and I will tell her every word." Thomas Hale's face relaxed then, as if some great weight had been lifted from him, and he managed something that was almost a smile. "Mesilla," he said again, softer now. "Ask for the Crawford place on Cal de Guadalupe near the old church. Everyone in town knows her. She teaches the children their letters when their mothers cannot spare the time, and she sews for half the county besides. She has hair like autumn wheat and a laugh that—" He did not finish the thought. His eyes had gone distant, fixed on something beyond the junipers and the red rock and the wide, indifferent sky, and a moment later his hand went slack in Stephen's grip, and Thomas Hale was gone. Stephen Archer sat beside the body for a long while, the horses shifting and stamping behind him, the wind moving through the dry grass with a sound like breathing. He had seen death before, on the trail, and in the war his father had fought before him, but there was something different about watching a stranger die with another man's name on his lips, something that settled into his chest and would not be shaken loose. He buried Thomas Hale himself, working through the afternoon with a shovel borrowed from his own gear, piling stones over the grave to keep the coyotes from it. And when he was finished, he stood over the mound of red earth with his hat in his hand, and said the only prayer he could remember from his mother's Bible, the one about valleys and shadows, though he could not recall if he said it right. Then he mounted his horse, gathered the lead ropes of the string he still had to deliver, and turned his face south and east, toward Mesilla, more than 150 miles distant across some of the hardest country in the territory, carrying in his saddlebag a dead man's ring and a dead man's letter, and a promise he intended to keep if it killed him. He delivered the horses to the rancher in Silver City 3 days later, collected his pay, and told the man he would not be riding on with the outfit as planned, that he had business elsewhere. The rancher, a weathered man named Coker who had employed Stephen on and off for 2 years, studied him with narrowed eyes and asked if the business had a name. "A promise," Stephen said, and would say no more, and Coker, who had buried a wife and 2 sons on this hard land and understood something of promises made to the dying, only nodded and wished him Godspeed. The road from Silver City to Mesilla in the autumn of 1878 was no easy stretch of country. It ran south through the Mimbres Valley and skirted the edges of the Black Range, where Apache bands still moved in defiance of the reservations. The government had tried to hold them too. Past the mining camps where fortune and desperation lived side by side, and down at last into the wide, flat basin of the Rio Grande where cottonwoods grew gold in the autumn light. Stephen had ridden much of it before, driving cattle and horses for men who paid him to know the water holes and the passes, and he knew that a careful man could make the journey in 6 or 7 days if the weather held and no trouble found him. He did not expect the weather to hold, and he did not expect to be so lucky about the trouble. On the 2nd day out of Silver City, following the old road that hugged the base of the mountains, Stephen came upon tracks that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. The same shoeing pattern, he was nearly certain, on several of the horses that had crossed his path the day he found Thomas Hale dying, tracks that led off the main trail toward a box canyon where a man might hide for weeks without being found. He did not follow them. He was not a lawman, and he was carrying nothing more than a Colt revolver and a Winchester rifle, no match for a gang of the size Thomas had described. And besides, he told himself, his business now was with the living, not the dead, and Louisa Crawford would not be served by his getting himself killed trying to avenge a man he had known only in his final hour. But the gang found him anyway, or near enough. On the 4th evening, as he made camp in a dry arroyo with a small fire shielded from the wind, 3 riders came down out of the rocks with guns already drawn, and Stephen understood at once, from the way their leader's eyes went first to his saddlebags rather than his face, that these were not men looking for simple robbery. "Evening," said the leader, a broad man with a drooping mustache and eyes the color of old coffee. "You would be the fellow found Tom Hale out on the Black Range Road." Stephen kept his hands loose at his sides, near enough to his pistol to matter but not so near as to invite a bullet. "I found a dying man," he said carefully. I do not recall him giving his last name before he passed. Do not play the fool with me. The leader spat into the dust. Word travels faster than you rode, mister. Folks in Pinos Altos knew Hale struck a rich vein, and folks along this road knew he was carrying his fortune out with him. Now he is dead and his gold is gone, which is no concern of mine, but there is talk he had something else on him besides gold. A letter, a ring. Sentimental trash, maybe, but trash some folks might pay to make disappear, on account of what a letter can say about who did the killing. Stephen understood then that these were Rourke's men, or some part of them, and that they had not been entirely thorough in searching Thomas Hale's body before they left him to die, and that word of an unaccounted witness had reached them and troubled them more than the gold itself. A dying man's testimony, carried by a living witness, was worth more to a jury than any amount of silver. There was nothing on him when I found him but the clothes on his back, Stephen said, which was near enough a lie to trouble his conscience later, but he said it steady and looked the leader in the eye while he said it. I buried him proper and rode on. If you are looking for a witness against you, mister, you are looking in the wrong camp, because I never saw a face among the men who did this. It was a gamble, and a poor one, for the leader studied him a long moment with those coffee-colored eyes, clearly weighing whether to search his gear right there in the dark and settle the matter with a bullet regardless of what he found. But it was full dark now, the fire had burned low, and perhaps the numbers did not sit right with him. 3 against 1, but the one calm enough to suggest he was not bluffing, or perhaps some scrap of caution held him back. Whatever the reason, after a long silence the leader spat again and jerked his head toward his companions. We will be watching the road south, he said, backing his horse away. A man carrying tales can lose his tongue easier than he thinks, mister. Remember that. They rode off into the dark, and Stephen sat by his dying fire with his heart hammering and his hand shaking only slightly as he fed another branch to the coals. And he did not sleep again that night, watching the rim of the arroyo for shapes that did not come. In the morning he broke camp before first light and rode hard, choosing a rougher trail through the foothills that added a day to his journey but kept him off the road the outlaws claimed to be watching. And he did not breathe easy again until he had put 2 full days between himself and that camp. It was on the 6th day, deep in a stretch of broken country where the trail climbed through piñon and juniper toward a high pass, that his luck ran out in a different fashion. His horse, tired and footsore from the rough going, stumbled on loose scree and went down hard, and Stephen, thrown clear but not clean, felt his left arm strike a boulder with a crack that told him at once the bone had broken. He lay in the dust for a long moment, breathing through the white blaze of pain, while his horse scrambled up nearby, favoring a foreleg but otherwise sound. He was 3 days from the nearest town he knew of, alone, with a broken arm and no one to set it, and he understood in that moment how close a man could come to failing a promise not through any fault of will, but through simple bad fortune, the kind that visited travelers in this country with no more warning than a shift of loose stone. It was smoke that saved him, a thin gray thread rising from a canyon below the trail, and though every instinct born of frontier caution told him to avoid an unknown camp, the pain in his arm and the fading light left him little choice. He led his limping horse down toward the smoke and found, gathered around a small fire in the shelter of a rock overhang, a family of Chiricahua Apache, an old man with silver-streaked hair and a face seemed like old leather, a woman perhaps his daughter or his wife tending a cook pot, and 2 children who scattered at the sight of him before creeping back to peer from behind their elders. Stephen had heard enough talk in the cattle camps and mining towns to know the fear that ran both directions in this country. Apache bands driven from their homes onto reservations too small and too poor to sustain them, breaking away when hunger or grief or plain desperation demanded it, and settlers who saw every band, friendly or not, as a threat to be met with a rifle first and questions never. He had no wish to add to that fear, and so he stopped well short of the fire, raised his good hand palm out in the universal sign of peace, and called out that he meant no harm, that his horse had thrown him and his arm was broken, and that he asked only for shelter until the pain allowed him to think straight. The old man studied him for a long moment, then said something to the woman in a language Stephen did not know, and she rose and came toward him without fear, examining his arm with quick, capable hands before speaking to the old man again. It was the old man who finally addressed Stephen in halting Spanish, which Stephen understood well enough from his years working alongside vaqueros on the cattle trails. "You are hurt bad," the old man said. "My daughter will set the bone. It will hurt more before it hurts less. You understand this?" "I understand," Stephen said, and gritted his teeth as the woman, whose name he would later learn was Naya, splinted his arm with sticks and strips of cloth cut from her own shawl, her touch firm and sure despite his groans, while the old man, who called himself Closen, held him steady and spoke to him in a low, calm voice throughout, telling him, Stephen gathered from the little Spanish mixed in, that pain passed and bones healed, and a man who had ridden this far alone with such purpose in his eyes must have good reason to keep riding. They kept him 3 days in that canyon, feeding him from their own small stores of dried meat and corn, and in that time, through broken Spanish and gesture and patience on both sides, Stephen came to understand something of their circumstance. That they had left the reservation at Ojo Caliente not from any wish for war, but because the promised rations had failed again, because the land they had been given could not feed them, because their young men grew restless and angry at broken promises made by men in Washington who had never set foot in this country and never would. Closen spoke of it without heat, only a deep and abiding weariness, as a man speaks of an old wound that has stopped bleeding but never quite healed, and Stephen, listening, felt something shift in him, some easy assumption he had carried without examining it, and he was ashamed of how little he had thought before about what it cost a people to be pushed always further from what had once been simply their home. "I am sorry," he said finally, on the second night, "for what has been done to your people. I do not know that sorry is worth much, but I mean it." Closen looked at him for a long moment across the fire. "Sorry is a beginning," he said. "It is not enough. But it is more than most give." He nodded toward Stephen's splinted arm. "You carry something important. I see it in how you watch the trail even lying still. Tell me." And so Stephen told him, in halting fragments of Spanish and English that Closen pieced together with more patience than Stephen felt he deserved, the story of Thomas Hale dying in the rocks, and the woman named Louisa Crawford waiting in Mesilla, and the promise made under the wide sky with a dying man's hand locked around his wrist. Closen listened without interrupting, and when Stephen finished, the old man nodded slowly. "A man who keeps his word to the dead," he said, "is a man worth helping to keep it." He looked to his daughter, and some exchange passed between them that Stephen could not follow, and in the morning, when his arm was strong enough to bear a sling and his horse had rested and recovered from its stumble, Closen gave him directions to a shorter trail through the mountains that would save him 2 full days, a trail known to his people, but not marked on any surveyor's map, and pressed into his good hand a pouch of dried meat and corn cakes for the journey. "Tell the woman," Closen said as Stephen prepared to ride, "that her man's love found its way home even after he could not. That is a thing worth more than gold and rarer besides." He paused. "And tell whoever will listen in that town of yours that the Chiricahua are not the enemy the newspapers make of us. We only wish to live. Is that so different from what you wish, or she wishes, or any man wishes?" "It is not different at all," Stephen said, and meant it, and he rode away from that canyon with his arm aching but his heart somehow lighter, carrying not only Thomas Hale's letter but a new understanding he had not expected to find on this journey, and a debt of gratitude to a family who owed him nothing and had given him everything they could spare. The shorter trail close in had shown him cut 2 days from his journey as promised, and on the 10th day since he had buried Thomas Hale in the rocky ground of the Black Range, Stephen Archer rode at last into the town of Mesilla, his arms still splinted and aching, his clothes gray with trail dust, his horse thin from the hard travel, and his heart pounding with something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but some tangled cousin of both. Mesilla in that autumn of 1878 was a town of adobe walls and cottonwood trees, its plaza busy with the traffic of freight wagons and the calls of vendors selling chili and corn, the old church of San Albino standing at one end, with its bell tower catching the last gold light of the afternoon. Stephen asked the first man he passed, an old vaquero mending a saddle in the shade of a portal, for the Crawford place on Cal de Guadalupe, and the man pointed him down a narrow street lined with low adobe houses toward a building with a faded sign reading CRAWFORD's Dry Goods, the shop below dark and shuttered but a light burning in the window above. He tied his horse to the post outside and stood a long moment on the packed dirt street, his hand resting on the saddlebag that held the letter and the ring, and he found himself more nervous than he had been facing down 3 armed outlaws in the dark, because a gun he understood, but grief he was not certain he knew how to carry gently enough. He climbed the outside stair to the door above the shop and knocked, and after a moment it was opened by a young woman who could not have been more than 16, her dark hair pulled back plainly, her eyes widening at the sight of a stranger, road-worn and travel-stained, standing on her threshold with his arm in a sling. "I am looking for Miss Louisa Crawford," Stephen said, removing his hat with his good hand. "My name is Stephen Archer. I have come a long way to speak with her about a matter of some importance." The girl hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder into the room behind her, and then a voice called out, a woman's voice, tired but not unkind. "Emily, who is it?" "A man asking for you," the girl called back, and stepped aside, and Stephen found himself looking past her into a small, neat room where a woman rose from a chair beside a sewing table, setting aside a half-finished garment, her hair the color of autumn wheat exactly as Thomas Hale had described it, though pulled back now in a simple braid, her face pale and lovely, and marked with the particular weariness of someone who has carried too much for too long alone. "I am Louisa Crawford," she said, coming toward the door, and there was something wary in her voice, as if strangers arriving at her door with important matters had not, in her experience, brought good news. "Do I know you, Mr. Archer?" "No, ma'am," Stephen said. "You do not, but I believe you have been waiting a long time for word of a man named Thomas Hale." The color drained from Louisa's face so quickly that Stephen feared she would faint, and she caught the doorframe with one hand, her knuckles white. "You have news of Thomas." Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. "Please, Mr. Archer, I have waited so long, I have almost—" She stopped herself, as if unwilling to say aloud what she had almost done, which was give up entirely on hope itself. "Please come in. Sit down. Emily, fetch some water for our guest." Stephen stepped into the small room, aware suddenly of how out of place he must look, dusty and unshaven, his arm bound in a rough sling, among the neat furnishings and the careful order of a household kept by a woman determined that poverty and grief should not show in the corners of her rooms. A boy of perhaps 14 looked up from a book at the table, his eyes sharp with the same wariness his sister had shown, and Stephen guessed this must be the brother Thomas had mentioned, though he had not caught the name. "This is my brother Daniel," Louisa said, following his glance, "and my sister Emily, whom you have met. Please, Mr. Archer, sit and tell me what you have come to say. I would rather hear it plain than have you soften it, whatever it is. I have imagined every manner of terrible thing these past months, since his letters stopped coming, and I do not think you could tell me anything worse than what I have already feared in the dark." Stephen sat, because his legs felt suddenly unsteady, and he set his hat on his knee and looked at this woman who had waited so long and hoped so hard, and he found the words Thomas had asked him to carry rising up in him with a weight he had not fully understood until this moment, standing at last at the end of the road. "Miss Crawford," he said, "I found Thomas Hale on the road through the Black Range, 10 days back now, dying from a gunshot wound given him by outlaws who robbed him of the gold he had earned in the mines at Pino's Altos. I was traveling alone with a string of horses, and I heard him before I saw him, and I got to him in time to hear him speak, though not in time to save him. I am sorry, ma'am, more sorry than I know how to say, but Thomas Hale is dead and has been these 10 days, and I have come all this way because he asked me, with the last breath in his body, to bring you his words myself." Louisa Crawford made a small sound, not quite a sob, more like the air going out of something that had been holding its shape too long against too much pressure, and she sank into the chair beside her sewing table, as if her legs had simply stopped answering her. Emily rushed to her side, and Daniel rose from the table, his young face gone white and rigid, and for a long moment no one in the room said anything at all, only the sound of the clock on the mantel ticking, and somewhere below in the street, the distant creak of a wagon passing. "Dead," Louisa said finally, as if testing the word, as if it were a garment she had to try on to see whether it would fit the shape of her grief. "He is dead. All this time I thought. I told myself he had simply found an easier life somewhere and forgotten us, that perhaps he had never truly meant to come back at all, and I hated myself for thinking it, but I could not stop, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was that something terrible had happened and I would never know. And now you tell me the terrible thing did happen, and somehow that is almost a mercy. God forgive me for saying so, because at least now I know." "He never forgot you," Stephen said, and reached into his coat where he had kept the letter close against his chest the whole journey, safer there than in the saddlebag where a fall or a river crossing might have ruined it. "He wrote you this letter the night he found the silver that made his fortune, and he carried it with him ever since, meaning to give it to you himself. And there is this." He drew out the small pouch and opened it, tipping the thin gold ring into his palm, and held it out to her. "He asked me to give you these, and to tell you his exact words, as near as I could remember them, and I have gone over them in my mind every day of this journey so that I would not fail him in the telling." Louisa took the letter with trembling hands but did not open it, not yet, holding it against her chest instead, as if she needed a moment to gather her courage before facing what was written there. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what he said." Stephen closed his eyes briefly, calling back that scene beneath the juniper tree, the dry wind and the failing light and the desperate grip of a dying man's hand. "He said to tell you that he loved you every day he was gone, and that he never stopped meaning to come home, and that if you had waited this long already, you should know it was not in vain, because he thought of you with every shovel of earth he turned in that mine." His voice caught, and he pushed through it because he had promised, and a promise made to the dead was not one a man set down halfway. "And he said, this part most of all, Miss Crawford, he was most particular that I get this part right. He said to tell you that you must not go on grieving a man who is not worth your tears, that he would rather you laughed again in this world than wept for him in it, and that you should live, whatever shape that living took, and find happiness, because that was worth more to him than anything, more than the gold, more than his own life even." Louisa Crawford began to cry then, not the delicate tears of parlor grief, but the deep, racking sobs of a woman who has held herself together through years of hardship by sheer will, and finally allows herself to break. And Emily wrapped her arms around her sister and wept with her, and Daniel stood rigid by the window with his jaw clenched and his eyes bright, trying in the manner of young men, not yet grown into the freedom of grief, to hold his own tears at bay. Stephen sat with his hat on his knee and did not know what to do with his hands, feeling that he had delivered something true and necessary, but also something that had torn open a wound he could not now help her close. "I am sorry," he said again, when the worst of the weeping had passed and Louisa had drawn a shuddering breath and wiped her face with the back of her hand. I know sorry does not mend anything, but I promised him I would carry his words to you, and I promised myself I would see that promise through no matter what stood in the road, and I have tried to keep both promises as best I could." "You buried him?" Louisa asked. "Properly." "Not left for," she could not finish the thought, and Stephen understood the particular horror that haunted people in this hard country, of loved ones lost to the wilderness and never properly laid to rest. "I buried him myself," Stephen said, "beneath a juniper tree on the road through the Black Range, and covered the grave with stones to keep the animals from it, and said what prayer I could remember over him. I can take you there myself if you wish it when you are able to make the journey, so that you might see the place and grieve properly." Louisa looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time past the shock of the news he carried. This travel-worn stranger with his arm in a sling and his eyes steady, and kind despite the exhaustion plain in every line of his face. "You rode all this way," she said slowly, "with a broken arm to bring me his last words. You did not have to do that, Mr. Archer. You could have sent a letter or told someone in Silver City to pass the word along, or simply ridden on about your own business and let the matter lie." "I could have," Stephen admitted. "But I made a promise to a dying man, and it did not feel like a thing I could hand off to someone else and still call it kept. Besides," he added, and felt his face warm slightly under the dust and the beard he had not had opportunity to shave in 10 days, "I do not believe I could have lived easy with myself, knowing there was a woman somewhere waiting for word that would never come, if I had it in my power to bring it to her myself." Something passed between them in that moment, some current that had nothing to do with the grief that had brought them together, and Louisa looked away first, back down at the letter still pressed against her chest, and said, "I should read this alone, if you do not mind. There are things in it, I think, that were meant for no eyes but mine." "Of course," Stephen said, rising. "I will find lodging in town and trouble you no further tonight, Miss Crawford. I only wish to see the words delivered as I promised." "Where will you stay?" Louisa asked, and there was something in the question that seemed to want him not to disappear entirely into the town's shadows. Not yet, not after carrying so much of her heart's history across so many miles. "There is a boarding house near the plaza, I am told," Stephen said. "I saw the sign as I rode in." "Mrs. Alvarado's place," Daniel said, speaking for the first time, his voice rougher than a boy's ought to be, thickened with grief he was fighting to master. "It is clean, and she sets a good table." "I can show you if you like, Mr. Archer, seeing as you are hurt and do not know the town." Stephen looked at the boy, recognizing in his offer both the natural courtesy of a well-raised child and the deeper need to be doing something, anything, with his hands and his feet rather than sitting still with grief pressing in on every side. "I would be obliged," he said, "if your sister does not mind sparing you." "Go, Daniel," Louisa said softly. "I would rather you were occupied just now than watching me weep." And so the boy fetched his own hat and led Stephen back down the outside stair and along the darkening street toward the plaza, and Stephen, glancing back once, saw Louisa Crawford standing in the lamplit window above the shop, the letter finally open in her hands, her face turned toward the page and illuminated by the lamp's warm glow, and something in the sight of her, grieving and beautiful and so entirely unaware of how she was watched, settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples he suspected would not come again soon. Mrs. Alvarado's boarding house proved everything Daniel had promised, clean and modest, run by a widow with sharp eyes and a soft heart who took one look at Stephen's sling and travel-worn face, and declared she would not charge full price for a man in such a state, and set about heating water for him to wash and finding him a room with a proper bed rather than a cot in the common room. Daniel lingered in the small parlor while Stephen settled his few belongings, and it was clear the boy had more to say and was working up the courage to say it. "Was it quick?" Daniel asked finally, standing near the door with his hands shoved into his pockets. "His dying, I mean. Did he suffer much?" Stephen considered lying, considered offering the kind of comfort that smoothed away hard truths, and then thought of Thomas Hale's own insistence on plain speaking even in his final hour, and decided the boy deserved the same courtesy. "He was in pain," Stephen said, "but it did not last long past when I found him, and he was calm at the end, thinking of your sister rather than his own hurt. I do not believe he suffered more than any man does, facing what he had to face, and I believe knowing his words would reach her gave him some peace in his last minutes." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Louisa has been waiting 3 years," he said, "since before our parents died even." Thomas asked Pa for her hand before he left for the mines, and Pa gave his blessing, and then not 2 months later the cholera took both our parents inside a week of each other, and Louisa has been raising Emily and me ever since, running the store, taking in sewing, teaching the little ones their letters for whatever coin or trade folks could spare, all while waiting for Thomas to send word he had money enough for them to marry. She never complained, not once, not even when the store barely broke even and we had to sell Pa's good horse to make it through last winter. She just kept saying Thomas would come, Thomas would send for us. We only had to be patient a while longer. His voice roughened. "And now he is dead, and all that waiting was for nothing, and I do not know how to help her carry that, Mr. Archer. I am only 14. I do not know how a man is supposed to comfort his sister when the thing she has built her whole life around for 3 years turns out to have been a grave in the ground the whole time." Stephen felt the weight of the boy's words settle alongside his own exhaustion, and he thought of Closen's steady voice by the fire, telling him that sorry was a beginning but not enough on its own. "I do not have an answer for that," he said honestly. "I do not think there is a tidy answer, Daniel. Grief does not work that way in my experience. But I will tell you this. Your sister has raised you and your sister alone for 3 years through hardship that would have broken lesser people, and a woman with that much strength in her does not simply stop having it because grief has come to visit. She will need time, and she will need people around her who do not press her to hurry through it, but I do not believe she will break. I have known her only these few hours, and even I can see that much." Daniel studied him for a long moment, something calculating in his young face that reminded Stephen he was dealing with someone growing quickly into the responsibilities of manhood, whether the world waited for him to be ready or not. "You said you buried him," Daniel said. "You did not have to do that either. Most men would have left him for the next traveler to find or reported it to the nearest sheriff and ridden on." "Most men might have," Stephen agreed. "I could not see my way to it." "Why?" Daniel asked, direct in the way of the young. "Why go to all this trouble for a stranger?" Stephen considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I have buried people before," he said finally. "My own mother when I was younger than you are now, and my father some years after, and a few good friends besides, taken by sickness or accident or simple bad luck, the way this country takes people. Every time, I have wished someone had been there to carry their last words to whoever needed to hear them, and mostly there was no one, and those words just died with the person who spoke them, unheard. When Thomas Hale asked me to carry his words to your sister, I understood I was being given a chance to be, for once, the person who does not let that happen. I could not turn away from that, Daniel, not for any reward and not from any threat neither. Some promises a man makes to himself long before he ever meets the person he is making them for." Daniel said nothing for a while, and then, unexpectedly, he stepped forward and shook Stephen's good hand, a gesture too formal and too old for a boy of 14, but earnest for all that. "Thank you, Mr. Archer," he said, "for coming all this way, for burying him proper, for telling us plain instead of dressing it up in comfortable lies." He hesitated at the door. "Will you stay in Mesilla a while? Louisa will want to visit the grave, I think, once she is able, and she does not know the country between here and the Black Range the way you do." "I had not made any plans beyond delivering the letter," Stephen admitted. "I do not see the harm in staying a spell if I can find work to cover my keep. Your sister may need the escort, and my arm needs time to mend regardless. There is always work for a man who can ride and is not afraid of it, Daniel said, some of the boy's natural spirit returning despite the day's grief. Old Sanchez needs hands for his cattle, and the freight office is always short of drivers who know the roads. You will not starve in Mesilla, Mr. Archer. I can promise you that much. He left then, and Stephen sat a long while on the edge of the narrow bed in Mrs. Alvarado's boarding house, his arm aching dully beneath its splint, his mind full of the image of Louisa Crawford standing in her lamplit window with Thomas Hale's last letter open in her trembling hands, and he found himself thinking, with a mixture of guilt and wonder he did not entirely know what to do with, that he was in no great hurry to leave this town at all. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Stephen with its gentleness after the hard travel that had brought him to Mesilla. His arm, tended by a local doctor who pronounced the Apache woman's splinting sound work despite his evident surprise at learning its source, healed steadily over the following weeks, and he took light work at the freight office, driving supply wagons along the shorter routes that did not strain his mending bone, and boarded on with Mrs. Alvarado, who fed him generously and asked no more questions than he cared to answer. He saw Louisa Crawford often in those first weeks, though never alone at first, always in the company of her sister or brother or the general bustle of the town, at church on Sundays where she sat with her family in a pew near the front, at the plaza market where she sold her sewing work alongside the vegetable sellers and the tinkers, in the store below her rooms where she reopened for business after a week of shuttered mourning because, as she told him plainly one afternoon when he stopped in to purchase a new shirt, grief did not feed her brother and sister, and the rent on the shop did not wait for a widow's heart to mend. I am not truly a widow, she said, folding the shirt with careful hands, since we never married, though it feels near enough to that some days. I do not know what to call myself now, Mr. Archer. A woman who loved a man for 3 years and buried her hope of him without ever standing beside him at an altar. You do not have to call yourself anything you do not choose to, Stephen said. Grief does not require a proper name to be real. She looked up at him then, something searching in her gaze, and he thought, not for the first time, how tired she looked, and how that tiredness did nothing to diminish the plain, striking loveliness of her face, the strong set of her jaw, the clear intelligence in eyes that had clearly seen more hardship than a woman her age, which he guessed to be near 25, ought to have borne alone. You have been very kind, staying on in this town when your business here was finished the moment you handed me that letter, she said. Daniel tells me it was his idea, that you might escort me to the grave when I am ready, but I wonder if that is the whole truth of why you have stayed, Mr. Archer. Stephen felt his face warm and did not trust himself to answer with complete honesty. Not yet. Not so soon after the wound of Thomas Hale's death was still so raw in her. My arm needed mending, he said instead, which was true enough as far as it went, and I find I like your town, and the work at the freight office pays fair, and I have no pressing business elsewhere that calls me away. A man can stay in a place simply because it suits him, without there needing to be some deeper design behind it. Perhaps, Louisa said, though something in her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced, and she handed him his purchase and made no further comment, though Stephen thought he saw, just before he turned to leave, the faintest suggestion of a smile touch the corner of her mouth, the first he had seen from her since his arrival. It was nearly a month before Louisa felt strong enough to make the journey to Thomas Hale's grave, and Stephen arranged the trip carefully, borrowing a gentle mare for her from Mrs. Alvarado's own stock, and choosing a route that avoided the stretch of road where he had encountered Rourke's men, though he did not tell Louisa the full reason for the detour, not wishing to burden her further with fears of outlaws on top of her grief. Daniel came with them, insisting he had a right to see the place where his sister's intended had been laid to rest, and Emily stayed behind in the care of Mrs. Alvarado, judged too young yet for so hard a journey. They rode 3 days to reach the site, camping beneath the stars in country that grew steadily wilder and more beautiful as they climbed toward the Black Range. And in those long evenings around the campfire, with Daniel often asleep early from the day's exertion, Stephen and Louisa fell into conversations that ranged far beyond the immediate purpose of their journey. She asked him about his own life, and he found himself telling her things he had not spoken of in years. His mother's death from fever when he was 12, his father's slow decline afterward into a grief-soaked drinking that had driven Stephen from home at 16 to make his own way on the cattle trails, the long solitary years since spent drifting from outfit to outfit, never quite settling anywhere long enough to call it home. "That sounds a lonely sort of life," Louisa observed one evening, the firelight catching the gold in her hair. "It suited me well enough," Stephen said, "until lately." He did not elaborate, and she did not press him, though he saw her glance at him sidelong with something thoughtful in her expression before she looked back to the fire. She told him in turn of her own childhood in Mesilla, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had come west from Missouri, with dreams of prosperity that the harsh economics of frontier retail had only partly rewarded, of meeting Thomas Hale at a church social when she was 19, and he a young clerk newly arrived from Ohio with ambitions bigger than his prospects, of the courtship that followed, careful and proper, and the engagement that had seemed, for one golden season, to promise everything she had ever wanted. "I loved him," she said simply on the second night, staring into the fire. "I want you to understand that, Mr. Archer, whatever else I might come to feel or think in the months ahead. I loved Thomas Hale, and the grief I carry for him is real, and I do not intend to dishonor his memory by pretending otherwise, not to you and not to myself." "I would never ask you to," Stephen said, and meant it fully, though something in his chest tightened at the phrasing of her words, at the sense that she was speaking not only of the past but bracing herself, perhaps without fully admitting it, against some future she could feel approaching but was not yet ready to name. They found the grave on the 4th day, the stones Stephen had piled still undisturbed, the juniper tree above it having dropped its needles in a soft brown carpet over the mound of earth, and Louisa knelt beside it a long while in silence, her hand pressed flat against the cool stones, while Stephen and Daniel stood back a respectful distance and let her grieve in whatever manner she needed. When she finally rose, her face was wet but calmer than Stephen had yet seen it, as if some necessary rite had been completed that allowed a door in her heart to close, gently, without slamming. "Thank you," she said to Stephen, as they made camp that night for the ride home, "for bringing me here and for burying him with such care in the first place. I do not think I could have found peace without seeing this place, without knowing he rests somewhere with dignity rather than lost to the wilderness. You have given me something very precious, Mr. Archer, and I do not know how I will ever repay it." "You owe me nothing," Stephen said. "I only did what any decent man would have done." "I have met a great many men in this territory," Louisa said quietly, "and I promise you decency of the kind you have shown is rarer than you seem to believe." The ride back to Mesilla passed more easily than the ride out, the worst of the grief having been set down, if not fully resolved, at the graveside, and Stephen found himself increasingly aware, in ways he had not permitted himself before, of how much he had come to look forward to Louisa Crawford's company, the sharpness of her wit when she forgot to guard it, the tenderness she showed her brother even when exhaustion frayed her patience, the quiet strength that had carried her and her siblings through 3 years of hardship without once, so far as Stephen could tell, allowing herself the luxury of complete collapse. It was perhaps 6 weeks after their return from the grave, in the deepening cold of early winter, that trouble found Mesilla in a form Stephen had hoped, perhaps foolishly, might have stayed behind him in the mountains. He was at the freight office loading supplies for a run to Las Cruces when a rider came in fast from the north road, his horse blown and sweating despite the cold, calling for the sheriff before he had even fully dismounted. Word spread through the plaza within the hour. A gang of outlaws, 5 or 6 strong, had robbed a mining payroll shipment north of town and were believed to be heading south, possibly toward the border, and every able-bodied man was asked to keep watch and report any strangers seen loitering near the outskirts. Stephen felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach even before Sheriff Boone Hatcher, a broad, weathered man with a graying mustache and a reputation for steady judgment, described the gang's leader to the gathered townsfolk. A broad man with a drooping mustache, riding a black horse with a white blaze, known in these parts as Mesilla's Rourke. He found Louisa that evening at the store, helping Emily with the accounts by lamplight, and drew her aside with a gravity that clearly alarmed her before he had spoken a single word. "There is something I did not tell you," he said, "about the men who killed Thomas. I did not wish to frighten you before it seemed necessary, but I think now it has become necessary." He told her then of his encounter on the trail, the 3 riders who had questioned him about a letter and a ring, the threat they had made about a man who carried tales losing his tongue, and Louisa listened with growing alarm, her hand rising unconsciously to her throat. "You never told me you were in danger," she said. "All this time, and you let me think the only risk you took was the broken arm from your horse falling." "I did not wish to add to your burden," Stephen said. "You had grief enough to carry without fearing for a stranger's safety on top of it." "You are not a stranger," Louisa said, with a heat that surprised them both. "And you have not been for some weeks now, Stephen Archer, whatever careful distance you have tried to maintain between us out of some misplaced sense of propriety toward a dead man's memory. If Rourke's gang is in this territory now, and they know your face, then you are in danger this very night, sleeping under Mrs. Alvarado's roof not 4 streets from where I sit, and I will not pretend otherwise simply, because it frightens me to say it plain." It was the first time either of them had spoken so directly of the feeling that had grown between them across the weeks of shared grief and quiet companionship, and Stephen felt something in his chest loosen at hearing her name him, finally, as something more than a helpful stranger passing through her life. "I do not know that Rourke would recognize me on sight," Stephen said carefully. "It was full dark when we spoke, and I doubt he got a clear look at my face by the light of a dying campfire, but I will not lie to you and say there is no risk. A gang like that, cornered and desperate with a stolen payroll to protect, might do anything if they believed a witness to their earlier crime was within reach." "Then you must go to Sheriff Hatcher," Louisa said. "Tell him everything. If Rourke is truly in the territory now, robbing payrolls, the law will want every scrap of information that might help them run him down, including what you know of Thomas's murder." Stephen had avoided this course for weeks, uncertain how much good it would do and unwilling to draw further attention to himself while his arm still mended. But Louisa's argument, delivered with the same clear-eyed practicality that had kept her family fed and sheltered through 3 hard years, could not be easily dismissed, and the following morning he presented himself at the sheriff's office and told Boone Hatcher everything. The ambush that had killed Thomas Hale, the confrontation on the trail, the description of the gang's leader and his 2 companions. Hatcher listened with the careful attention of a man who had spent 20 years separating useful information from idle talk, and when Stephen finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and studied him with new respect. "You are the fellow been keeping company with the Crawford woman," he said, not quite a question. "Seen you about town these past weeks." "I have been staying in Mesilla, yes," Stephen said, feeling his neck heat slightly at the phrasing. "Well, Mr. Archer, I will tell you plain. This is useful information, and it may help us corner Rourke sooner than we would otherwise manage, since we now have a better notion of his numbers and his habits. But I will also tell you this. If Rourke gets wind that the man who saw his face and heard his crimes described is sitting comfortable in Mesilla, courting a respectable young woman no less, he may decide this town is worth a visit regardless of the payroll money, simply to tie off a loose thread before it hangs him. I would advise caution, and I will post extra watches on the roads north of town. But I cannot promise you or Miss Crawford perfect safety, not against a man as desperate as Rourke has become." The following week passed in a tension that settled over the town like a held breath, extra deputies riding the roads, ranchers keeping closer watch on their stock and their families, and Stephen dividing his time between his work at the freight office and an increasingly urgent need to be near Louisa Crawford's household, a need he no longer troubled himself to disguise as mere neighborly concern. He took to sleeping some nights in the small storage room behind the shop, at Daniel's insistence and eventually Louisa's own quiet agreement, his rifle within easy reach, a decision that scandalized no one in a town accustomed to the practical necessities of frontier safety, but that nonetheless drew Stephen and Louisa into a closeness that neither of them, perhaps, would have permitted themselves under calmer circumstances. It was on a cold night some 10 days after Stephen's meeting with the sheriff that the trouble came to a head. Stephen woke to the sound of a horse being ridden hard through the street below, followed by the sharp crack of a gunshot and Daniel's voice crying out in alarm from the room above. He was on his feet with his rifle in hand before he had fully gathered his wits, taking the outside stair 2 steps at a time, and burst into the family's rooms to find Louisa standing near the window with Emily pulled close against her, Daniel at the door with a shotgun that had belonged to their father clutched in shaking hands, and outside in the street, unmistakable even in the darkness, the broad shape of Silas Rourke sitting his black horse with the white blaze, 2 riders flanking him, all 3 with pistols drawn. "Archer," Rourke called, his voice carrying easily up to the window, "I know you are in there. Word travels in a town this size, and I have heard plenty about the man who buried Tom Hale and has been sweet on his woman ever since. I am not a patient man, and I have a payroll to see safely across the border before Hatcher's posse runs me down, so I will make this simple. You come out here and swear before witnesses that you never saw my face on that trail, and never will speak a word of it to any lawman living, and we will ride on and leave this town in peace. You refuse, and I will burn this building to the ground with everyone in it, and blame it on Apache raiders same as I have done before when it suited me." Stephen felt cold fury rise in him at that last claim, some crime laid unjustly at the feet of people who had shown him nothing but kindness when they owed him none, and he understood in that moment that whatever happened next, he could not simply comply and let Rourke ride away to commit further violence unanswered. "I already told Sheriff Hatcher everything," Stephen called back, his voice steadier than he felt. "The truth is out, Rourke. Burning this house will not put it back." There was a silence from the street, and then Rourke's voice again, harder now. "Then I suppose we have nothing left to discuss, do we?" And Stephen heard the unmistakable sound of a match being struck. What happened next occurred with the swift, chaotic violence of frontier confrontations, remembered afterward only in fragments. Stephen firing through the window at the rider nearest the torch, the shot going wide but startling the horse enough to throw its burning cargo into the dirt street, where it sputtered and died before it could catch on the dry adobe wall. The sudden thunder of more hooves as Sheriff Hatcher and 2 deputies, alerted by the earlier gunshot, and already patrolling the streets in anticipation of exactly this kind of trouble, came pounding around the corner with weapons drawn. Rourke's shouted curse, and the wheeling scramble of his men as they realized the odds had shifted against them. A brief exchange of gunfire in which one of Rourke's companions was struck and fell from his horse, and Rourke himself, seeing the fight lost, spurring his black horse into a desperate gallop down the street with Hatcher and his deputies in immediate pursuit. It was over in less than 2 minutes, though it felt to Stephen, crouched by the window with his heart hammering and Louisa's frightened breathing audible behind him, like it had lasted an hour. Rourke was run down 3 miles outside of town by Hatcher's posse, cornered in a dry wash with no way forward and no wish, in the end, to die for a payroll that could not be spent from a grave, and he surrendered his weapons without further bloodshed. His wounded companion, taken alive, proved willing enough to testify against his former leader in exchange for leniency, confirming Stephen's account of Thomas Hale's murder in full detail. And within the month, Silas Rourke stood trial in Las Cruces for robbery and murder both, a trial that Stephen and Louisa attended together, sitting side by side in the small courtroom as the jury delivered its verdict, and the judge pronounced sentence, closing at last with the finality of law rather than mere memory, the terrible chapter that had begun beneath a juniper tree in the Black Range. It was in the weeks following the trial, as the shock of that violent night faded into the ordinary rhythms of winter in Mesilla, that Stephen finally found the courage to speak plainly of what had been growing in his heart since the moment he first saw Louisa Crawford standing in her lamplit window with a dead man's letter pressed against her chest. He asked her to walk with him one Sunday afternoon after church, along the acequia that ran behind the plaza where the bare cottonwoods stood black against a sky the color of pale winter fire, and for a long while they walked in silence, Louisa's hand resting lightly in the crook of his good arm, the splint having come off some weeks before, though he still favored the limb somewhat in the cold. "I have been trying to find the words for this since near the beginning," Stephen said finally, stopping beneath one of the great old trees, "and I confess I do not know that I have found them even now, but I do not think waiting longer will improve my chances, so I will simply say it as plain as I know how. I love you, Louisa Crawford. I have loved you, I think, since that first evening I watched you read Thomas's letter through your window, though I did not have any right to name the feeling then, and I am not entirely certain I have earned the right to name it now, given everything you have lost and everything you are still grieving. But I cannot go on pretending it is not there, and I would rather risk your anger by speaking it plain than lose you by keeping silent." Louisa was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the frozen surface of the acequia, and Stephen felt his heart drop with each passing second of her silence, certain he had moved too soon, spoken too boldly, dishonored somehow the memory she still carried of the man she had waited 3 years to marry. "I have loved Thomas Hale," she said finally, "and I will grieve him in some quiet corner of my heart for the rest of my life, because that is simply what love does when death interrupts it before its proper season. I do not think that grief will ever fully leave me, Stephen, and I would not want it to, because it is proof that what we shared was real and worth the pain of losing." She turned to face him then, her eyes bright with unshed tears but her voice steady. "But Thomas himself told you with his last breath that he wanted me to live, to find happiness, whatever shape it took. I did not understand when you first told me those words how literally I would come to need them. I thought perhaps I would spend my life simply managing my grief, running the store, raising Emily and Daniel, growing old alone with only memory for company. I did not think happiness, real happiness, the kind that makes a person glad simply to wake in the morning, was still available to me." She reached up and laid her palm gently against his cheek, rough with the cold and the beginning of a winter beard. "But then you rode into my life carrying his last words, and you stayed, and you were kind and patient and brave when bravery was needed. And somewhere in these past months I found myself glad to wake each morning again, glad in a way I had not expected to feel ever, and I think, Stephen Archer, that is Thomas's gift to me as much as it is yours. I love you too. I have for some weeks now, though I did not trust myself to say it while the grief was still so raw. I do not think loving you is a betrayal of what I felt for him. I think it is exactly what he asked of me, in the only way that mattered." Stephen felt something break open in his chest, some long-held tension dissolving into a relief so profound it left him briefly unable to speak, and he gathered her into his arms beneath the bare cottonwood, the winter light falling gold and thin around them, and kissed her for the first time with a tenderness that held within it all the long hard miles that had brought him to this moment. The dying man's grip on his wrist, the outlaws in the dark, the broken arm and the Apache family's kindness, the weeks of careful distance and growing closeness, all of it gathering now into this single point of certainty, that whatever the territory had cost him to cross, it had delivered him exactly where he was meant to be. They were married the following spring, in the old church of San Albino, where Louisa had worshipped since childhood, the pews filled with the town's shopkeepers and ranchers and their families, Daniel standing as Stephen's best man with a pride that had grown into something like genuine brotherhood over the months of their acquaintance. Emily scattering wildflowers before the bride, with a solemnity that made the whole congregation smile despite the tears many of the women could not help shedding at the sight of Louisa Crawford, so long resigned to grief, walking down the aisle radiant with a happiness that had seemed impossible only a year before. Sheriff Boone Hatcher attended, standing near the back with his hat respectfully removed, and afterward at the small celebration held in the plaza he shook Stephen's hand and told him that Silas Rourke, sentenced to hang for his crimes, had gone to the gallows in Las Cruces the previous month without confession or apology, but that at least the territory was safer for his removal, and Thomas Hale's death, though still a tragedy, had not gone entirely without justice. Closen and his daughter Naya, whom Stephen had ridden north to find some months earlier, unable to let the death of his healed arm go unacknowledged, could not attend a wedding held in a town they had every reason to distrust, but Stephen had brought them gifts instead, blankets and provisions and a good rifle for Closen's grandson, and had told them, in the halting Spanish that had grown more fluent with practice, that he owed his happiness in no small part to their kindness, and that he would not forget it as long as he lived. Closen had received the gifts with quiet dignity and told him in turn that a man who remembered kindness shown to him by strangers was a rare thing worth honoring, and had wished him and his bride a long life together, full of children and good fortune, a blessing Stephen carried home with him and repeated to Louisa on their wedding night, both of them moved by the generosity of people who had so little cause, given all they had suffered, to extend such warmth to a stranger from the world that had wronged them. They settled in Mesilla, where Stephen took steady work managing the freight office's growing operations, and eventually, with money saved carefully across several years, bought a small ranch outside town where he ran cattle and horses of his own, work that suited him far better than the drifting life he had led before, now that he had a home and a family worth staying settled for. Louisa kept the store for some years, training Emily to take over its management as the girl grew into capable young womanhood, and eventually devoted herself more fully to teaching, opening a proper schoolroom in a building purchased with Stephen's ranching profits, where she taught not only her own children but half the town's, becoming known throughout the county as the finest teacher Mesilla had ever known. Daniel grew to manhood under Stephen's steady influence, learning ranching alongside him and eventually taking a share in the growing operation, and when he married some years later, a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, it was Stephen who stood beside him at the altar in turn, the two men having grown, across years of shared work and shared history, into something closer than mere brothers by marriage. Stephen and Louisa had 4 children together across the years that followed, a son first, born the following winter and named Thomas, at Louisa's quiet insistence, in honor of the man whose last words had brought them together, a decision Stephen embraced fully, understanding that the boy's name honored not a rival for his wife's heart but the very thread of love and duty that had woven their own lives together. Then a daughter, Sarah, quick and clever like her mother. Then twin boys some years after, wild and inseparable, who kept the whole household laughing despite the trouble they inevitably found. And this large, warm family filled the ranch house with a noise and joy that Stephen, remembering the long, solitary years of his drifting youth, never once took for granted. On the anniversary of Thomas Hale's death each autumn, Louisa and Stephen made the journey together, and later with their growing children, to the grave beneath the juniper tree in the Black Range, tending the stones and leaving fresh flowers when the season allowed, and telling the story to their children as they grew old enough to understand it. How a dying man's love had traveled across the territory in a stranger's keeping. How that same stranger had found, in the delivering of another man's heart, the beginning of his own truest happiness. And how grief and love, far from standing opposed to one another, had proven themselves in the end to be two branches of the very same tree. Louisa never stopped honoring Thomas's memory, keeping his letter pressed carefully in the family Bible alongside the record of her children's births, a quiet acknowledgement that the man who had loved her first had also, in his final words, given her the courage to love again. And Stephen never stopped being grateful, in ways he tried to express to his children as they grew, for the strange grace of a territory that had asked so much of him in the crossing and given back in the end so very much more. A woman to love for the whole of his life, a family to call his own, and the enduring knowledge that even in a hard and unforgiving land, kindness carried far enough, and faithfully enough, could still find its way home. They grew old together on that ranch outside Mesilla, watching the territory itself transform around them across the decades, the railroad arriving eventually to change the pace of frontier life, statehood coming to New Mexico long after they had first built their home there, their children marrying and raising children of their own, until the ranch house rang, each Christmas and each summer gathering, with the voices of grandchildren who knew the old story of the letter and the ring, and the dying man's last words as well as they knew their own names, a family legend passed down not as tragedy but as testament. That love, once given honestly, never truly dies, but finds new channels through which to flow, carried always, in the end, by those brave enough to bear it forward.